Well, hello there, night owls and insomniacs. Tonight, we're going to dive into something that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about agriculture and divine intervention. We're talking about farmers, yeah. Ordinary dirt dash under dash the dash fingernails farmers who literally saved entire civilizations because they had some pretty wild dreams. Now, before you settle in with that pillow you've been fluffing for the last 10 minutes, do me a small favor and hit that like button if you're genuinely vibing with what I do here. And hey, subscribe if you want more of these bizarre historical rabbit holes delivered straight to your sleepless nights. Drop me a comment too. Where are you listening from, and what ungodly hour is it where you are? I'm genuinely curious about my fellow sleep-deprived historians. And listen, if you drift off somewhere between ancient Egypt and medieval Europe, well, that's exactly what we're going for here. Think of me as your historically accurate human melatonin. Because tonight, we're harvesting some absolutely insane tales of prophetic dreams that quite literally kept people from starving to death. So get comfortable, because we're about to explore how visions of drought, floods, and bumper crops have guided farming decisions that fed entire civilizations. And trust me, some of these stories are so bizarre, you'd think I was making them up, but I'm not. Let's start with probably the most famous agricultural dream in human history, and no, I'm not talking about your weird nightmare about being chased by a giant corn maze. I'm talking about Joseph, that colorful coat-wearing biblical figure who basically became ancient Egypt's first economic advisor because he could interpret dreams like he was reading the morning newspaper. But here's what most people don't realize about this story. It's not just some feel-good Sunday school tale about forgiveness and divine providence. This is actually one of the most sophisticated examples of economic planning and agricultural crisis management in the ancient world. And it all started because a guy in prison could tell the difference between fat cows and skinny cows in someone else's nightmare. Picture this, your pharaoh, ruler of the most powerful civilization on earth around 1650 BCE Egypt, at this time isn't just another ancient kingdom. It's basically the Silicon Valley of the Bronze Age. They've got the most advanced irrigation systems, the most sophisticated bureaucracy, the most powerful military, and enough wealth to make other civilizations weep with envy. You literally own everything from the first cataract of the Nile all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. But you're having these absolutely bonkers dreams that are keeping you awake at night. First dream, 7 incredibly fat, healthy cows come up out of the Nile River. And when I say fat, I mean these cows are so well fed they can barely walk. They're grazing peacefully along the riverbank, just living their best bovine life. Then suddenly, 7 other cows emerge from the river, but these ones are so thin and sickly that you can literally see their ribs. They look like they haven't eaten in months. And here's where it gets weird. These skinny cows walk right up to the fat cows and eat them. Not just kill them, but actually devour them completely. And even after eating 7 fat cows, the skinny cows still look exactly as emaciated as before. Second dream, same night. 7 ears of grain growing on a single stalk. And these aren't just normal grain ears, they're plump, full, golden, absolutely perfect specimens of agricultural abundance. Then 7 more ears of grain sprout up on the same stalk, but these ones are thin, withered, and obviously blighted by the east wind. And just like in the cow dream, the withered ears somehow swallow up the good ears, leaving nothing behind. Now, most people would wake up and think, man, I really shouldn't eat that late-night falafel before bed. But Pharaoh? He's the ruler of Egypt. He's supposed to be the living embodiment of divine wisdom. People literally worship him as a god. And he has absolutely no idea what these dreams mean, which is probably terrifying when you're supposed to be omniscient. So Pharaoh does what any rational ancient ruler would do. He calls in every magician, wise man, and dream interpreter in Egypt. And we're not talking about a few local fortune tellers here. Ancient Egypt had an entire professional class of dream interpreters. These guys had studied at temples. They had access to extensive dream interpretation libraries. They knew all the traditional symbolic meanings. This was serious, scholarly dream analysis. But here's the thing, none of them can figure it out. Not a single one. They try every traditional interpretation method. They consult their scrolls and tablets. They perform divination rituals. They probably sacrifice a few animals for good measure. Nothing. The dreams are too specific, too unusual, too outside the normal categories of royal dream symbolism. Enter Joseph, who at this point has been sitting in Pharaoh's prison for somewhere between 7 and 13 years, depending on which scholarly timeline you follow. And let me tell you, ancient Egyptian prisons were not pleasant places. We're talking about stone cells with minimal food, no sanitation, and guards who weren't particularly concerned about prisoner welfare. Joseph is probably malnourished, definitely traumatized, and has every reason to be bitter about his circumstances. But here's where the story gets really interesting from a historical perspective. Joseph isn't Egyptian, he's a Hebrew, which means he comes from a completely different cultural tradition of dream interpretation. Hebrew dream analysis was much more focused on practical, real-world implications rather than symbolic religious meanings. While Egyptian dream interpreters might see cows in dreams as representations of various deities or cosmic forces, Hebrew tradition would be more likely to interpret cows as literal indicators of agricultural and economic conditions. So Joseph gets dragged out of prison, and I imagine he's not looking his best after years of incarceration, and brought before the most powerful man in the known world. Pharaoh describes these dreams that have stumped every expert in Egypt, and Joseph takes one look at them and essentially says, "Oh, that's easy. You're going to have 7 years of incredible harvests followed by 7 years of absolutely devastating famine." The dreams are identical because this is definitely going to happen, and it's going to happen soon. But here's where Joseph really proves his genius, because he doesn't just interpret the dreams. He gives Pharaoh a complete economic and agricultural management plan. And this plan is so sophisticated it would impress modern economists. First, Joseph tells Pharaoh to find the wisest man in Egypt and put him in charge of the entire national food supply. Then, during the 7 good years, the government should collect 1/5 of all grain produced, not as punishment, but as a national strategic reserve. This grain should be stored in government-controlled granaries in every major city throughout Egypt. The stored grain needs to be carefully managed, rotated to prevent spoilage, and protected from theft and corruption. Think about how revolutionary this advice was. Most ancient governments collected taxes in the form of grain or other agricultural products, but they usually used those taxes immediately to feed the army, to fund construction projects, to support the royal court. The idea of systematically storing vast quantities of grain for future emergencies was essentially unprecedented on this scale. But Joseph's plan goes even further. He recommends that Egypt not just store grain, but actively manage the entire agricultural economy during the famine years. When the 7 years of abundance end and the famine begins, the government should sell the stored grain, not just to Egyptians, but to neighboring countries that will also be affected by the famine. Egypt should become the regional food distributor, essentially monopolizing grain sales throughout the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Now, did Pharaoh listen to this advice from a Hebrew ex-prisoner? You bet he did. And not only did he listen, he put Joseph in charge of implementing the entire plan. Joseph goes from prison to becoming essentially the prime minister of Egypt, second in power only to Pharaoh himself. And here's where the historical evidence gets really fascinating. Archaeological excavations throughout Egypt have uncovered massive granary complexes that date to exactly this period. We're talking about storage facilities that could hold tens of thousands of tons of grain. These weren't small local storage buildings. They were enormous, sophisticated warehouse complexes with advanced ventilation systems, pest control measures, and elaborate security features. Even more interesting, these granary complexes show evidence of having been built according to a unified architectural plan. They're too similar across different regions of Egypt to have been independent local projects. Someone with serious authority was clearly implementing a coordinated national food storage program. When the 7 years of famine hit and multiple ancient sources confirmed that there was indeed a period of severe famine throughout the eastern Mediterranean during this time period, Egypt was not just prepared, they were positioned to profit from the crisis. While neighboring civilizations were collapsing into chaos, Egypt was selling grain to desperate foreign delegations. The biblical account describes representatives from Canaan, Phoenicia, and other regions traveling to Egypt to buy grain. But what's really remarkable is that this isn't just Hebrew propaganda. Egyptian records from this period actually confirm that they were exporting grain to foreign countries during a time of regional famine. Hieroglyphic inscriptions describe foreign delegations arriving in Egypt specifically to purchase food supplies. But here's the kicker: this dream didn't just save Egypt from starvation. It fundamentally transformed their entire approach to economic planning and risk management. Joseph's interpretation created what was essentially the world's first national food security program, complete with strategic reserves, price controls, and international trade management. The long-term impact is even more impressive. Egypt's successful management of the famine crisis established them as the dominant power in the region for centuries. Other civilizations that had been devastated by the famine never fully recovered their previous strength, while Egypt emerged from the crisis wealthier and more powerful than before. Archaeological evidence suggests that the agricultural and economic innovations introduced during Joseph's administration continued to influence Egyptian policy for generations. The granary system was expanded and refined. The practice of maintaining strategic food reserves became standard Egyptian government policy. The international grain trade networks, established during the famine years, continued to generate wealth for Egypt long after the crisis had passed. From a purely practical standpoint, Joseph's dream interpretation represents one of the most successful examples of long-term economic planning in ancient history. Modern economists studying the biblical account have noted that Joseph's policies included virtually every element of effective crisis management: early warning systems, strategic reserve accumulation, market intervention, international trade coordination, and systematic wealth redistribution. But here's what really gets me about this story. Whether you believe the dreams came from divine revelation or from Joseph's own subconscious analysis of agricultural and economic patterns he'd observed, the practical results were identical. Joseph took information that seemed impossible to interpret and turned it into actionable policy that saved millions of lives and transformed an entire civilization. And that's the thing about agricultural prophecy that I find endlessly fascinating. Whether these dreams represent supernatural intervention or just incredibly sophisticated subconscious pattern recognition, they consistently lead to innovations that wouldn't have been possible through conventional thinking alone. Dreams don't just feed your subconscious. Sometimes they literally feed entire civilizations, and occasionally, they create the economic policies that define empires for centuries to come. Fast forward a few centuries to Roman-occupied Gaul, modern-day France for those keeping track, where a provincial farmer named Marcus Valerius Corvus had what might be the most practical prophetic dream in agricultural history. And yes, that was actually his name, which roughly translates to Marcus the Raven, though I suspect he got that nickname for reasons that had nothing to do with his farming abilities. This is around 350 AD, during what historians politely call the interesting times of the late Roman Empire. By this point, Rome is basically holding together with bureaucratic duct tape and increasingly desperate taxation policies. The empire is too big to govern effectively, too expensive to maintain, and facing constant pressure from Germanic tribes, who are getting tired of being on the wrong side of Hadrian's Wall and its various continental equivalents. But Marcus isn't worried about the grand sweep of imperial politics. He's just a guy with calloused hands and dirt permanently embedded under his fingernails, trying to grow enough wheat to feed his extended family and pay his Roman taxes, which, let me tell you, were about as popular as a plague of locusts and roughly twice as destructive to your personal finances. Marcus owns about 47 acres of reasonably fertile land in what's now the Loire Valley, which in the 4th century was considered prime agricultural real estate. His farm has been in his family for 3 generations, passed down from his grandfather, who originally received the land grant as payment for military service during one of Rome's many Gallic campaigns. It's good soil, adequate rainfall, reasonable proximity to markets. Everything a rational farmer could want for a comfortable, if not wealthy, agricultural life. But then Marcus starts having this recurring dream, and it's driving him absolutely insane. Night after night, he's standing in his fields during what should be planting season, and he keeps seeing the same bizarre vision, massive clouds rolling in from the west. But instead of the normal spring rains that every farmer in Gaul depends on, these clouds are dropping what looks like fine gray ash. In his dream, every farmer who plants their crops according to the traditional early spring schedule loses everything. Their seeds buried under inches of this mysterious ash, their soil contaminated, their entire growing season destroyed. But here's the weird part. In the same dream, Marcus sees farmers who wait until late spring. Well, after the traditional planting season not only surviving, but actually thriving. Their delayed crops, planted after this strange ash has settled and been washed away by later rains, produce the most abundant harvest he's ever seen in his dream state. We're talking about wheat so tall and full that it looks like something from a farmer's paradise fantasy. Now, any reasonable person would have dismissed this dream and stuck to agricultural practices that had worked for centuries. Planting late goes against everything farmers knew about maximizing the growing season. Early spring planting allowed crops to establish strong root systems before the intense summer heat, gave plants the maximum possible time to mature before autumn frosts, and aligned with natural precipitation patterns that provided crucial moisture during germination. Delaying planting by 6 weeks would mean shorter growing seasons, increased risk of early frost damage, potential water stress during the hottest summer months, and reduced yields across the board. Every piece of conventional agricultural wisdom suggested that Marcus's dream was not just impractical, but potentially catastrophic for anyone foolish enough to follow it. But Marcus can't shake the image of that ash falling from the sky. The dream is so vivid, so consistent, so detailed that he starts obsessing over it. He begins paying attention to weather patterns in ways he never had before, watching cloud formations, noting wind directions, studying the behavior of migrating birds. He starts asking traveling merchants about weather conditions in other parts of the empire, trying to understand if anyone else has noticed unusual atmospheric phenomena. His wife, Claudia, a practical woman who manages the household, finances and has no patience for impractical fantasies, thinks he's losing his mind. His neighbors, fellow farmers who have known him since childhood, start whispering that the stress of imperial taxation has finally driven Marcus over the edge. The local Roman administrator, a career bureaucrat named Gaius Antonius, who's responsible for ensuring adequate grain production for regional tax obligations, becomes increasingly concerned about Marcus's apparent descent into agricultural madness. But Marcus becomes absolutely convinced that his dream is showing him something crucial about the coming growing season. He starts calculating the potential economic impact of following his dream versus sticking with conventional planting schedules. If he's wrong about the dream, late planting will probably reduce his harvest by about 30%, significant but not necessarily catastrophic. If he's right about some kind of ash fall during normal planting season, early planting could mean losing everything. So Marcus does something that requires either tremendous courage or complete insanity. He decides to follow his dream guidance, but not just for his own farm. He starts talking to other farmers in his region, describing his recurring vision, explaining his interpretation of what the dream might mean. Most of them laugh at him. Some of them openly suggest that he's suffered some kind of mental breakdown. But a few farmers who have known Marcus for years and respect his normally practical approach to agriculture start listening. Marcus is particularly persuasive with farmers who are already struggling financially. If you're barely making ends meet under normal circumstances, the prospect of a catastrophic crop failure is terrifying enough that even an impractical dream starts looking like reasonable insurance. Better to definitely lose 30% of your harvest than potentially lose everything? By early March, Marcus has convinced 17 other farming families in his immediate region to join him in delaying their planting. That might not sound like a lot, but in a rural agricultural community, 18 families represents a significant portion of the local farming population. These families collectively control over 800 acres of prime agricultural land. and their decision to follow Marcus's dream guidance is going to have serious economic implications for the entire region. The local Roman administrator is reportedly furious. Late planting means lower projected yields, which means reduced tax revenue, which means Gaius Antonius is going to have to explain to his superiors why his district is underperforming compared to other regions. Roman bureaucrats did not advance their careers by allowing tax revenues to decline, especially during a period when the empire desperately needed every possible source of income. Marcus and his fellow late planters face intense social pressure to abandon their plan and plant according to normal schedules. The regional Catholic bishop, because by this point Christianity is becoming increasingly influential in Gaul, delivers sermons about the dangers of following pagan dream guidance instead of trusting in God's natural order. Local merchants who depend on predictable harvest schedules for their trading operations start pressuring the farmers to return to conventional agricultural practices. But Marcus holds firm, and so do most of his converts. They spend March and early April preparing their fields, maintaining their equipment, and watching nervously as their neighbors plant crops according to traditional schedules. The other farmers in the region are doing everything right. The soil conditions are perfect. The early spring weather is ideal for germination, and initial crop growth looks extremely promising. Then, in the third week of March, something extraordinary happens. Mount Vesuvius. Yes, that Vesuvius, the same volcano that destroyed Pompeii nearly 3 centuries earlier, has a significant eruption. Not as catastrophic as the 79 AD disaster that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum, but substantial enough to send massive quantities of volcanic ash high into the atmosphere. Now, under normal circumstances, an eruption in southern Italy wouldn't directly affect agricultural conditions in Gaul. Vesuvius is over 1,000 miles away from Marcus's farm, and volcanic ash typically doesn't travel that far unless carried by very specific atmospheric conditions. But 350 AD turns out to be a year of highly unusual weather patterns throughout Europe. A persistent high-pressure system over the western Mediterranean, combined with unusually strong westerly winds, carries the volcanic ash cloud in a northwesterly direction across the Italian peninsula, over the Alps, and directly into the heart of Gaul. Weather conditions that occur maybe once every few centuries align perfectly to transport Vesuvius's ash directly over Marcus's region during the first week of April, the early planters, farmers who followed. Conventional agricultural wisdom and planted their crops in March watch in horror as inches of fine volcanic ash settle over their newly sprouted wheat and barley. The ash doesn't just cover the plants. It actually penetrates the soil, creating an alkaline layer that interferes with root development and nutrient absorption. Seedlings that looked healthy and promising in March are buried under a gray blanket that effectively sterilizes their growing environment. Within days, it becomes clear that the early planted crops are completely destroyed. The volcanic ash has created conditions that make normal plant growth impossible. Farmers who planted according to traditional schedules face the complete loss of their spring crops, which means no harvest, no income, and no ability to pay Roman taxes or feed their families through the coming winter. But Marcus and his fellow late planters are watching this disaster unfold while their own fields remain unplanted and therefore unaffected by the ashfall. They wait patiently while spring rains gradually wash most of the volcanic ash out of the soil, leaving behind a thin layer of mineral-rich sediment that will actually prove beneficial for plant growth. When they finally plant their crops in late April and early May, exactly the timing Marcus had seen in his dreams. They're planting in soil that has been naturally fertilized by volcanic minerals and thoroughly cleansed by weeks of spring precipitation. The growing conditions are actually better than anyone could have expected under normal circumstances. The results are extraordinary. Marcus's delayed harvest produces yields that are significantly higher than normal. Some sources suggest increases of 200 to 300% over typical harvests. The volcanic ash, once it had been properly integrated into the soil by natural weathering processes, provided exactly the type of mineral supplements that wheat and barley need for optimal growth. But the implications go far beyond Marcus's individual success. Word of the late planting strategy spreads rapidly throughout. Gaul, as farmers in other regions, observed the dramatic difference between the ash-affected early crops and the thriving late-planted fields. What started as one farmer's bazaar, dream becomes a widely adopted agricultural technique that helps stabilize food production across much of Roman Gaul during what could have been a catastrophic agricultural crisis. The regional impact is significant enough that Roman administrative records from the period specifically mention the adoption of delayed planting schedules in response to the volcanic ash incident. Other provinces begin incorporating flexible planting strategies into their agricultural planning, acknowledging that unusual weather or environmental conditions might require departures from traditional farming practices. Even more interesting, Marcus's success inspires systematic changes in how Roman agricultural administrators approach farming policy. Instead of rigidly enforcing traditional planting schedules, regional governors begin allowing more flexibility in agricultural timing, recognizing that local environmental conditions might require adaptations to conventional practices. The long-term agricultural impact extends well beyond the immediate volcanic ash crisis. The delayed planting techniques that Marcus pioneered proved useful for dealing with other environmental challenges, late spring frosts, unusual precipitation patterns, pest infestations that typically affect early planted crops. Within a generation, flexible planting schedules become standard practice throughout much of Gaul. From a historical perspective, Marcus's dream-inspired agricultural innovation represents one of the clearest examples of how individual, agricultural experiments can influence broader economic and social systems. His willingness to follow seemingly impractical dream guidance led to practical techniques that improved food security for entire regions of the Roman Empire during a period of increasing environmental and political instability. Sometimes the best solutions come from embracing disaster rather than fighting it, even when that solution first appears to you in a dream about impossible ash falling from impossible skies and impossible patterns that turn out to be completely possible after all. Okay, this next one is going to mess with everything you think you know about medieval agriculture and the Irish potato famine. Because centuries before anyone in Europe had even heard of potatoes, an Irish monk named Brother Coleman was having dreams about them. And I'm not talking about vague, symbolic dreams about mysterious underground vegetables. I'm talking about incredibly detailed, technically accurate dreams about potato cultivation techniques that wouldn't be formally developed by European agriculture for another 800 years. This is the 8th century, specifically around 782 AD. And Brother Coleman is living in a monastery on the windswept coast of County Cork. Now, when I say windswept, I mean this place is so exposed to Atlantic storms that the monks probably spent half their time just trying to keep their buildings from blowing away. We're talking about medieval Ireland in all its harsh, unforgiving glory, a landscape where survival required constant adaptation to brutal weather, political instability, and soil conditions that would make modern farmers weep with frustration. Brother Coleman isn't your typical medieval monk. Yes, he spends the required hours in prayer and copying manuscripts, but his real passion is what we'd now call agricultural science. He's essentially the monastery's food security coordinator, responsible for making sure that 43 monks don't starve to death during the long, brutal Irish winters when fresh food becomes as rare as reliable sunshine. Medieval Irish monasteries were basically self-sufficient agricultural communities that happened to include a lot of praying. They had to grow their own grain, raise their own livestock, preserve their own food, and manage their own agricultural planning without any of the support systems that secular communities might have access to. If Brother Coleman screwed up the harvest planning, people would literally die of starvation before spring arrived. And let me tell you, 8th century Ireland was not an easy place to be a farmer. The climate was unpredictable, with late spring frosts that could destroy crops just as they were establishing, followed by cool, wet summers that prevented proper grain ripening, followed by early autumn frosts that could ruin harvests before they could be completed. The soil was often acidic and poorly drained, making it difficult to grow the wheat and barley that formed the foundation of medieval European agriculture. But then Brother Coleman starts having these absolutely extraordinary dreams. And they're unlike anything in his previous experience or in the religious tradition he's been trained in. In these dreams, he's walking through fields he's never seen before, examining plants that don't exist in 8th century Ireland, learning agricultural techniques that haven't been invented yet. The dreams always start the same way. He's standing in what looks like a monastery garden, but the plants are all wrong. Instead of the familiar wheat, barley, and vegetables that he knows, he's looking at strange plants with broad, green leaves growing above ground. But somehow he knows, with that weird certainty you sometimes have in dreams, that the real treasure is hidden underground. In his dreams, Brother Coleman finds himself digging into the soil beneath these mysterious plants, and what he discovers are these brown, knobby tubers that look nothing like any vegetable he's ever seen. They're roughly the size and shape of large stones, covered in what looks like rough, dirt-covered skin, but when he cuts them open in his dream, they reveal white, starchy flesh that somehow radiates nourishment and sustenance. But the dreams get more specific. Brother Coleman sees detailed visions of how these mysterious tubers should be planted, not as seeds scattered on the surface like grain, but as cut pieces buried in carefully prepared hills of soil. He dreams about the exact depth for planting, the proper spacing between plants, the type of soil preparation that would maximize yields. Even more remarkable, his dreams include information about storage and preservation techniques. He sees these tubers being stored in cool, dark places where they remain fresh and edible for months without rotting, something that was incredibly valuable in a medieval context where food preservation was a constant challenge. Most monks would have filed these dreams under interesting religious visions and focused on their regular duties. Medieval monasteries were familiar with symbolic dreams and mystical experiences, and Brother Coleman could easily have interpreted his potato dreams as some kind of spiritual metaphor about hidden spiritual nourishment or divine providence. But Brother Coleman has a practical streak that won't let him dismiss these dreams. The agricultural techniques he's seeing are so detailed, so specific, so technically sophisticated that they feel more like instruction manuals than symbolic visions. He starts keeping detailed written records of his dreams, documenting every aspect of the mysterious tuber cultivation he's witnessing in his sleep. And here's where this story gets historically fascinating, because Brother Coleman's dream journal has actually survived. It's housed in the library at Trinity College, Dublin, and scholars who have studied it are consistently amazed by the accuracy of his descriptions. His notes about soil preparation, planting techniques, and storage methods are remarkably similar to traditional Andean potato cultivation practices that Europeans supposedly had no knowledge of in the 8th century. But Brother Coleman doesn't just record his dreams. He becomes obsessed with finding these mysterious tubers in the real world. He starts experimenting with different root vegetables available in medieval Ireland, trying to find something that matches his dream visions. He modifies monastery food storage techniques based on his dream instructions, developing new methods for preserving root vegetables that prove remarkably effective. His fellow monks initially think he's developed an eccentric hobby. Medieval monasteries were accustomed to brothers who became obsessed with particular aspects of agricultural or scholarly work. But Brother Coleman's obsession goes beyond normal monastic interests. He starts trading with Viking merchants who regularly visit the Irish coast, specifically asking about strange foods from distant lands. Now, here's where the story becomes really intriguing from a historical perspective. Vikings in the 8th century were traveling throughout the Atlantic, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and even North America centuries before Columbus. While there's no historical evidence that Vikings brought potatoes back from the Americas, they were definitely encountering plant species that weren't available in Europe. Brother Coleman becomes particularly interested in trading relationships with Viking merchants who claim to have traveled to what they called Vinland, which most historians believe was somewhere along the North American coast. He's constantly asking these merchants about unusual vegetables and root crops they might have encountered in their travels. The really bizarre part is that Brother Coleman's dream journal includes descriptions of the specific type of soil conditions where his mysterious tubers would grow best. Acidic, well-drained soil that was common in mountainous regions but rare in most of medieval Europe. But Ireland, especially the western counties, actually had exactly the type of soil conditions he was describing. Following his dream guidance, Brother Coleman starts experimenting with potato-like cultivation techniques using available root vegetables. He develops methods for growing turnips and parsnips in hill-planted configurations that dramatically improve their yields. His food storage innovations, based on the preservation techniques he saw in his dreams, prove remarkably effective for extending the shelf life of root vegetables through harsh Irish winters. But the really extraordinary part of this story is what happens when Spanish conquistadors eventually bring actual potatoes back from South America in the 16th century. Brother Coleman's 800-year-old dream journal descriptions match the new world crop so precisely that early potato cultivation in Ireland follows, techniques that are remarkably similar to what he had documented centuries earlier. When potatoes are first introduced to Ireland in the late 1500s, Irish farmers who adopt the crop discover that Brother Coleman's medieval soil preparation methods are nearly perfect for potato cultivation. His hill planting techniques, his storage recommendations, even his notes about optimal planting depth proved to be extraordinarily accurate for actual potato farming. The agricultural innovations that Brother Coleman developed while pursuing his dream visions have practical impact that extends far beyond his individual monastery. Several monastic communities throughout medieval Ireland adopt his root vegetable cultivation techniques, and there's historical evidence that regions following his agricultural practices had significantly better food security during periods of crop failure. His storage and preservation methods spread throughout medieval Irish agricultural communities, helping improve winter food security for both monastic and secular populations. The hill planting techniques he developed proved useful for a variety of crops beyond just root vegetables, leading to improved yields for turnips, carrots, and other vegetables that were crucial for medieval Irish nutrition. From a modern historical perspective, Brother Coleman's story raises fascinating questions about the nature of prophetic dreams and agricultural innovation. Did he somehow receive genuine prophetic visions of a crop that wouldn't arrive in Europe for centuries? Was he an exceptionally innovative agricultural experimenter whose dreams provided creative inspiration for practical techniques? Was there some historical connection, perhaps through Viking trade networks, that gave him access to information about New World crops? Honestly, your guess is as good as mine. But what's undeniable is that Brother Coleman's dream-inspired agricultural experiments led to practical innovations that improved food security in medieval Ireland and accidentally created cultivation techniques that proved perfectly suited for potato farming centuries before potatoes arrived. The really remarkable thing is that when the Irish potato famine hits in the 1840s, some of the rural communities that survived the crisis are using traditional cultivation and storage techniques that can be traced directly back to Brother Coleman's 8th century innovations. His dream-inspired agricultural methods, passed down through oral tradition and practical application, actually helped some Irish farmers maintain food security during one of the most devastating agricultural crises in European history. Sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come disguised as impossible dreams, even when those dreams won't make practical sense for another 800 years, and even when following those dreams accidentally prepares your civilization for survival during future crises you can't possibly imagine. Let's hop over to 14th century China during the Ming Dynasty, where a rice farmer named Chun Wei-ming had a dream so preposterous that it accidentally revolutionized flood agriculture and saved thousands of lives during what historians call the Great Yangtze Flood. And when I say this dream was preposterous, I mean Chen was literally dreaming about rice that could float on water and somehow thrive during floods, which is like dreaming about fish that can fly or politicians who tell the truth. This is around 1344, during what was actually a pretty decent period for Chinese civilization. The Ming Dynasty has recently overthrown the Mongol Yuan Dynasty. There's renewed focus on agricultural innovation, and China is experiencing what historians call a golden age of technological and cultural development. The population is growing, cities are expanding, and there's generally optimism about the future, assuming you can avoid the occasional plague, famine, or regional rebellion. Chen Wei-ming isn't anybody special in the grand scheme of Chinese history. He's just another guy trying to grow enough rice to keep his extended family fed and the imperial tax collectors satisfied in a village called Shongjiang, located in the fertile river valley about 60 miles west of what's now Wuhan. His family has been farming the same plot of land for 4 generations, growing rice in the traditional paddies that had sustained Chinese civilization for millennia. But Qin has a problem that was pretty common for farmers along the Yangtze River: flooding. Every few years, sometimes several years in a row, the river would overflow its banks during the summer monsoon season and destroy entire seasons of rice crops. When the flooding was mild, farmers might lose 30 or 40% of their harvest. When it was severe, they could lose everything, not just the current crop, but their seed rice for the following year, their stored grain reserves, sometimes even their homes and livestock. Medieval Chinese farmers dealt with flooding the way you'd expect. They built elaborate dike systems. They planted rice on higher ground when possible. They developed sophisticated early warning networks to predict flood conditions, and they prayed to various river deities for protection. The imperial government maintained massive hydraulic engineering projects designed to control river flow, and local communities cooperated on flood management systems that represented some of the most advanced engineering in the medieval world. But despite all these precautions, catastrophic flooding remained a constant threat. Historical records from the period show that major Yangtze floods occurred roughly every 7 to 10 years, and truly devastating floods, the kind that could kill thousands of people and destroy entire regional economies, happened about once every generation. Qian has experienced 2 major floods during his farming career, and both times he's lost almost everything. The first flood, when he was a young man just starting his own family, destroyed his entire rice crop and forced him to borrow grain from relatives to survive the winter. The second flood, about 12 years later, was even worse. It not only destroyed his crops, but actually washed away several inches of topsoil from his paddies, requiring years of careful rehabilitation before the land was fully productive again. So when Qin starts having recurring dreams about floating rice, you can understand why his family initially thinks the stress of flood-prone farming has finally driven him over the edge. Because Chun isn't dreaming about better flood control or improved dikes or more effective early warning systems. He's dreaming about rice plants that somehow thrive during floods instead of being destroyed by them. In his dreams, Chen is walking through his familiar rice paddies, but everything is wrong in the most wonderful way possible. Instead of the shallow, carefully controlled water levels that traditional rice cultivation requires, his fields are completely flooded. We're talking about water levels that would normally drown rice plants and destroy entire crops. But somehow, in his dream, the rice plants are not just surviving this deep flooding, they're actually flourishing. The rice plants in Chun's dreams have these weird, elongated stems that stretch and bend with the water level. When floodwaters rise, the plants somehow grow taller to keep their grain heads above the surface. When the water recedes, the flexible stems adjust accordingly. It's like the rice plants are designed specifically for flood conditions rather than being vulnerable to them. But the dream gets even more bizarre. In Qin's visions, these flood-adapted rice plants actually produce higher yields during flood years than traditional rice produces under normal conditions. The flooding brings rich sediments that fertilize the plants. The deep water protects the rice from certain pests and diseases that normally affect rice crops, and the extended growing season in flooded conditions allows the plants to develop larger, more abundant grain heads. Any rational farmer would have dismissed these dreams as stress-induced fantasies and focused on more practical flood management strategies. Medieval Chinese agriculture was incredibly sophisticated, but it was also deeply conservative. Farmers stuck with techniques that had worked for centuries because failed. Agricultural experiments meant starvation for entire families. But Qin becomes absolutely obsessed with his floating rice visions. He starts studying his existing rice plants in much greater detail, looking for varieties that might have naturally longer or more flexible stems. He begins examining how different rice cultivars respond to varying water levels, paying attention to characteristics he'd never focused on before. Chang also starts researching traditional rice varieties that hadn't been widely cultivated in his region for generations. Medieval China had an enormous diversity of rice cultivars, different varieties adapted to specific soil conditions, climate patterns, and growing techniques. Most farmers focused on the highest yielding varieties that were well suited to their local conditions. But Qin becomes interested in older, less common rice types that might have unusual characteristics. His neighbors think he's completely lost his mind. You don't experiment with untested rice varieties when your family's survival depends on successful harvests. You don't invite flooding when every farmer's experience teaches that floods destroy crops. You don't pursue agricultural fantasies when practical flood control measures are available. But Qin's wife, Li Maifeng, is surprisingly supportive of his obsession. She's watched her husband struggle with the constant threat of flood damage for their entire marriage. And she's seen how the stress of potential crop loss affects not just their family's economic security, but Chun's mental health. If chasing impossible dreams about floating rice helps him cope with flood anxiety, she's willing to support his experiments, as long as he doesn't risk their entire livelihood on untested techniques. So Qin starts small. He sets aside a tiny portion of his rice paddies, maybe 1/20th of his total farming area, for experimental cultivation. He tracks down seeds from older rice varieties that supposedly had longer stems and better flood tolerance. He begins deliberately flooding small test plots to observe how different rice cultivars respond to extended submersion. His initial experiments are mostly failures. Most rice varieties, even those with supposedly superior flood tolerance, still die when subjected to the deep, prolonged flooding that Chun saw in his dreams. But occasionally he finds rice plants that survive longer submersion than expected, and he carefully saves seeds from these surviving plants for further experimentation. Chun's breakthrough comes when he discovers that several traditional rice varieties, ones that hadn't been widely cultivated in his region for decades, actually do have the elongated, flexible stems he'd seen in his dreams. These varieties had fallen out of favor because they produced slightly lower yields under normal conditions. But Qin realizes that their flood tolerance characteristics might make them superior choices for flood-prone areas. More importantly, Chun discovers that these flood-resistant rice varieties can be grown using cultivation techniques that are completely different from standard rice farming. Instead of maintaining shallow, controlled water levels, these varieties can actually be grown in paddies that are deliberately kept much deeper than normal. The plants adapt to the water depth, developing root systems and stem structures that are specifically suited to deep water conditions. When the Great Yangtze Flood hits in 1344, one of the most devastating floods in Chinese history that affects millions of people across multiple provinces, Chun's experimental rice plots become the focal point for one of the most remarkable agricultural success stories of the medieval period. While neighboring farmers watch their traditional rice crops disappear under floodwaters that are deeper and more persistent than anyone in living memory has experienced, Chun's floating rice not only survives, it produces the most abundant harvest he's ever achieved. His yields during the flood year are actually higher than what he typically harvested under normal conditions with traditional rice varieties. Word spreads quickly throughout the flood-affected region, because in the middle of a catastrophic agricultural disaster, abundant food gets everyone's attention. Local government officials, initially skeptical of Chun's unorthodox methods, become intensely interested when they realize that his techniques might provide a solution to flood-related crop failures that were devastating regional food security. Chun finds himself in the unusual position of being consulted by imperial agricultural advisors who want to understand how his flood-resistant rice cultivation works. He's asked to document his techniques, to provide seeds from his successful varieties, and to teach his methods to farmers in other flood-prone regions. The adoption of Chun's flood-resistant rice techniques spreads throughout the Yangtze River basin with remarkable speed. Within 3 years of the Great Flood, agricultural records show that significant portions of flood-prone, rice-growing regions have adopted some version of Chun's deep water cultivation methods. But the impact goes beyond just improved flood tolerance. Chun's techniques prove useful for expanding rice cultivation into areas that had previously been considered unsuitable for agriculture. Marshlands, seasonal wetlands, and areas with naturally high water tables suddenly become viable for rice production using his deep water methods. The long-term agricultural impact is substantial. Regions that adopt Chun's flood-resistant rice cultivation show significantly improved food security during subsequent flood years. The techniques also allow for expansion of rice production into marginal lands, increasing overall agricultural output throughout the Yangtze River Valley. From a technological perspective, Chun's innovations represent one of the most successful examples of medieval agricultural adaptation to environmental challenges. His flood-resistant rice varieties and deep water cultivation techniques become standard practice throughout much of China's flood-prone, rice-growing regions, and variations of his methods are still used by Chinese farmers today. Sometimes the best solutions come from embracing disaster rather than fighting it, even when that solution first appears to you in a dream about impossible floating rice that somehow turns out to be completely possible and remarkably practical. Our final main story takes us to 16th century Scotland, where a Highland clan chief named Hamish MacLeod had a dream that not only prevented a famine, but potentially prevented a clan war that could have devastated the Scottish Highlands for generations. And when I say this dream prevented warfare, I'm not talking about some feel-good story about peaceful conflict resolution. I'm talking about a dream about Danish oats that accidentally created the most successful agricultural diplomacy program in Highland history. This is 1572, and Scotland is going through what historians politely call a rough patch, which is like calling the Black Death a minor health inconvenience. The Protestant Reformation is tearing the country apart. Mary, Queen of Scots, is either inspiring passionate loyalty or murderous hatred depending on who you ask, and English raiders are making life miserable for everyone north of Hadrian's Wall. Meanwhile, clan warfare is so constant that some Highland families haven't had a peaceful harvest season in living memory. The MacLeod clan, like most Highland clans, is basically one bad harvest away from either starvation or having to raid their neighbors, which usually led to retaliatory raids, which led to clan wars, which led to nobody having time to plant crops, which led to more starvation, which led to more raiding. It was a vicious cycle that had been grinding down Highland communities for generations, and there was no obvious way to break out of it. Hamish MacLeod is the chief of a relatively small clan controlling territory on the Isle of Skye and parts of the western mainland. We're talking about maybe 800 people, spread across some of the most beautiful and agriculturally challenging landscape in Europe. The MacLeod lands include dramatic mountain scenery that looks fantastic in tourist photos. But try growing enough food to feed 800 people on rocky soil with a growing season that lasts about 4 months if you're lucky. Hamish isn't just a clan chief. He's essentially the CEO, military commander, chief judge, and agricultural coordinator for a community that's constantly teetering on the edge of survival. He's responsible for settling disputes, organizing defense against raiders, managing trade relationships with other clans, and somehow ensuring that his people don't starve to death during the brutal Highland winters. And let me tell you, 16th century Highland winters were not for the weak. We're talking about months of frozen ground, howling winds, and weather conditions that could kill you if you made the mistake of getting caught outside during a storm. Food preservation was crucial, because fresh food became essentially impossible to obtain between November and March. But Hamish's immediate problem isn't winter weather, it's the fact that 3 neighboring clans are eyeing MacLeod territory with the kind of interest that usually precedes military action. The Mackenzies to the east are dealing with their own food security issues and looking at MacLeod fishing rights along the coast. The MacDonalds to the south have been making increasingly aggressive comments about traditional clan boundaries. And the Campbells, well, the Campbells are always looking for opportunities to expand their influence, and they've been sending what you might politely call diplomatic envoys to discuss potential territorial adjustments. Under normal circumstances, Hamish would be preparing for war. Highland clan warfare in the 16th century was brutal but relatively predictable. You gathered your warriors, you raided your enemy's territory, you stole their livestock and destroyed their crops, and you hoped your military success would discourage further aggression, while providing enough captured resources to feed your own people through the crisis. But then Hamish starts having this recurring dream about oats, and it's driving him absolutely insane. Now you might think, oats, really? That's the most boring prophetic dream in Highland history. But stick with me, because this gets interesting fast. And it involves international trade, agricultural diplomacy, and what might be the most successful example of clan warfare prevention in Scottish history. In his dreams, Hamish sees the MacLeod lands covered with a specific type of oat that he's never encountered before. These aren't the traditional Scottish oats that Highland farmers have been growing for centuries, skinny, barely productive grain that required perfect weather conditions and produced mediocre yields even in good years. The oats in Hamish's dreams are dark, hardy, with grain heads that somehow resist both harsh weather and early frost. They look like oats designed specifically for highland growing conditions. But here's the weird part. In his dreams, these miraculous oats don't come from Scotland. They come from across the North Sea, from what looks like Norway or Denmark. Hamish keeps dreaming about Viking-style ships arriving at MacLeod harbors carrying sacks of these dark oat seeds, and somehow he knows that these foreign oats will grow successfully in conditions where traditional highland grains would fail completely. Even more bizarre in his dreams, Hamish sees himself trading for these oat seeds not with gold or silver, which the MacLeods don't have much of anyway, but with wool. High-quality Highland wool, which the MacLeod clan produces in abundance thanks to their large sheep flocks, but which they've never thought of as a valuable international trade commodity. Most clan chiefs would have ignored this dream and focused on more immediate military preparations. When you're facing potential invasion from 3 directions, you don't waste time on agricultural fantasies about foreign grain varieties. You sharpen your swords, you count your warriors, and you start planning defensive strategies that might keep your clan from being wiped out entirely. But Hamish becomes convinced that his dream is showing him a solution to the underlying problem that caused most Highland conflicts: food security. Think about it. If your clan had reliable, abundant food production, you wouldn't need to raid your neighbors. If your neighbors also had reliable food production, they wouldn't need to raid you. Most clan warfare was ultimately about resource competition, and if you could solve the resource problem, you might be able to prevent the warfare. So Hamish does something unprecedented in Highland history. Instead of preparing for war, he takes a significant portion of the clan's most valuable trade commodity, their finest wool, and organizes a trading expedition across the North Sea to find the mysterious oats from his dreams. His clan council thinks he's lost his mind. They're facing potential starvation. 3 neighboring clans are making hostile moves. English raiders are active throughout the region, and their chief is planning to trade away their most valuable resource for some theoretical grain seeds that might not even exist. The council meeting where Hamish announces his plan is reportedly one of the most heated in MacLeod clan history. His war chief, a practical man named Alasdair Moore, argues that they should be using their resources to hire mercenaries or purchase weapons, not chasing agricultural fantasies. His treasurer points out that trading away their wool reserves will leave them with no emergency funds for purchasing food if the oat experiment fails. His own brother suggests that the stress of leadership has driven Hamish into some kind of delusional state. But Hamish is absolutely convinced that his dream represents genuine prophetic guidance. He's seen these Danish oats in such vivid detail that he can describe their appearance, their growing characteristics, even the specific soil preparation methods they require. The dream feels more like a detailed instruction manual than a symbolic vision. Against significant opposition from his own advisors, Hamish organizes a trading expedition to Scandinavia. He sends his most experienced sea captain, Rorid MacLeod, with 2 ships carrying the clan's finest wool and specific instructions to find the exact type of dark, hardy oats that Hamish had seen in his dreams. Now, here's where this story gets historically fascinating. Trade relationships between Scotland and Scandinavia in the 16th century were actually quite extensive, but they focused mainly on luxury goods, furs, amber, high-quality metals. Agricultural trade was less common, partly because most regions preferred to maintain food security by growing their own crops rather than depending on imports. But Scandinavian countries, particularly Denmark and Norway, had been developing cold-resistant grain varieties for their own harsh climate conditions. Danish agricultural communities had spent generations breeding oat varieties that could survive early frosts, grow in poor soil conditions, and produce decent yields even during short growing seasons. When Roeryd MacLeod's trading expedition reaches Danish ports and starts asking about hardy oat varieties suitable for harsh northern climates, they find Danish merchants who are not only familiar with exactly the type of oats Hamish had described, but are happy to trade seeds for high-quality Scottish wool. The Danes have been looking for reliable sources of premium wool for their own textile industries, and Highland wool is considered some of the finest in northern Europe. The oats that Roeryd brings back to skymatch Hamish's dream descriptions with remarkable accuracy. They're dark, hardy varieties that Danish farmers call winter oats because of their ability to survive harsh weather conditions. They're supposedly capable of growing in marginal soil that would be unsuitable for other grain crops, and they have a reputation for producing consistent yields even during challenging growing seasons. The MacLeods plant these Danish oats in every marginal piece of land they can find: rocky hillsides, boggy areas, fields that had previously been considered unsuitable for grain production. They're essentially betting their clan's survival on Hamish's dream and some foreign oat, seeds that might not grow in highland soil. The results exceed even Hamish's most optimistic expectations. The Danish oats not only survive highland growing conditions, they thrive in ways that traditional Scottish grains never had. They grow successfully in rocky, acidic soil that had been considered worthless for agriculture. They resist early frosts that typically destroyed other grain crops. They produce yields that are significantly higher than anything the MacLeods had achieved with traditional Highland farming methods. But here's where the story becomes really remarkable from a political and social perspective. Other Highland clans notice the MacLeods' unprecedented agricultural success. And instead of raiding them for food, they start asking questions about the mysterious oats. Hamish, instead of keeping his agricultural breakthrough secret, makes a decision that probably prevented decades of Highland warfare. He offers to share his Danish oat seeds with neighboring clans in exchange for peace agreements and mutual defense pacts. Think about how revolutionary this approach was. Traditional Highland diplomacy was based on military strength, family alliances, and territorial control. The idea of using agricultural resources as the foundation for peaceful relationships was essentially unprecedented in Highland culture. But Hamish's agricultural diplomacy works because it addresses the underlying economic pressures that drove most clan conflicts. When the Mackenzies can grow abundant oats on previously unusable land, they don't need to raid MacLeod fishing grounds. When the MacDonalds have reliable grain production, they're less interested in territorial expansion. When everyone has adequate food security, the motivations for warfare largely disappear. Within 2 years, much of the Western Highlands has adopted Danish oat cultivation. The agricultural innovation spreads through a network of trade agreements and peace treaties that Hamish negotiates using oat seeds as diplomatic currency. Instead of preparing for war, Highland clans are sharing farming techniques and coordinating agricultural planning. The long-term impact is extraordinary. Historical records show that the period following the introduction of Danish oats was one of the most peaceful in Highland history. Clan warfare doesn't disappear entirely, but it decreases dramatically as communities focus on agricultural development rather than military competition. Food security improves throughout the region, population levels stabilize, and Highland communities begin developing more sophisticated trade relationships with the outside world. The agricultural surplus generated by successful oat cultivation provides resources for cultural and economic development that wouldn't have been possible during periods of constant warfare. From a modern perspective, Hamish's dream-inspired agricultural diplomacy represents one of the most successful examples of conflict prevention through economic development in medieval European history. His willingness to pursue seemingly impossible agricultural solutions led to practical innovations that fundamentally changed the social and political dynamics of Highland Scotland. Sometimes the most strategic military decision is to plant the right crop in the right place, especially when that strategy comes to you in a dream about Danish oats that accidentally creates the foundation for regional peace and prosperity. Let me tell you about Jean-Baptiste de Montclair, a French peasant farmer who had a dream so specific and so practical that it accidentally invented crop rotation techniques that wouldn't be formally understood by agricultural science for another 600 years. And when I say this dream saved his village from what they called the black soil death, I'm talking about an agricultural disaster that could have wiped out an entire community during one of the most challenging periods in medieval European farming. This is 1184 in the countryside outside what's now the city of Reims, during the height of the medieval warm period. Now, you might think a warm period would be good for agriculture, and initially it was, but by the late 12th century, the extended warmth had created some unexpected problems. Soils were becoming depleted from continuous cultivation without proper rest periods, and what medieval farmers called soil sickness was spreading across northern France like a slow-moving plague. Jean-Baptiste wasn't anybody special in the grand scheme of medieval French society. He was a villein, basically a serf who was tied to the land but had slightly more rights than a complete slave. He farmed about 20 acres of what had once been fertile land in the Champagne region, growing the standard medieval crops: wheat, barley, and whatever vegetables his family needed to survive the harsh northern European winters. But Jean-Baptiste had a problem that was becoming increasingly common throughout the region. His soil was dying. After generations of his family farming the same fields in the same way, planting the same crops in the same rotation patterns that had worked for centuries, the land was simply giving up. His wheat yields had been declining for 5 consecutive years. His barley was stunted and prone to disease. Even his vegetable garden was producing sad, undersized crops that barely sustained his family through the winter months. The local priest, Father Aldrich, had been preaching that the soil sickness was God's punishment for the sins of the community. Other farmers were convinced that evil spirits had cursed their land. Some believed that the extended warm weather had somehow poisoned the earth itself. But Jean-Baptiste had a more practical suspicion. He thought the problem was that they were asking too much from the soil without giving it anything back. Medieval French agriculture at this time was based on a two-field system. Half the land would be planted with crops while the other half lay fallow. But even this fallow land wasn't really resting. It was often used for grazing livestock or growing a different type of crop. There was no understanding of soil nutrients, nitrogen fixation, or the complex chemical processes that keep agricultural land productive over long periods. Then, in the late autumn of 1184, Jean-Baptiste starts having this recurring dream that's unlike anything he's ever experienced. In his dream, he's walking through his fields. But instead of the usual crops, he sees plants he's never grown before, strange legumes with pods that seem to glow with an inner light. In the dream, these mysterious plants are somehow feeding the soil, making it richer and darker with each passing season. But the dream gets more specific and more practical. Jean-Baptiste sees himself dividing his land into 3 sections instead of 2, and he sees a detailed planting schedule that rotates different types of crops through each section in a precise pattern. In the first year, one section grows grain, another grows the mysterious glowing legumes, and the third lies completely fallow, not grazed, not planted, just resting. In the second year of his dream cycle, everything shifts. The section that grew grain now grows the legumes. The section that grew legumes now lies fallow, and the fallow section now grows grain. In the third year, the pattern shifts again. Jean-Baptiste sees this rotation continuing year after year, and somehow he knows, with that weird certainty you sometimes have in dreams, that this system will restore his land's fertility and save his family from starvation. When Jean-Baptiste wakes up from this dream, he's completely obsessed with the details. The glowing legumes from his vision look like nothing he's ever seen, but they remind him of wild plants he's noticed growing along the edges of his fields, plants that most farmers consider useless weeds. These wild legumes have small white flowers and develop pods filled with tiny seeds that nobody bothers to harvest. Now, any rational medieval farmer would have dismissed this dream as fantasy and stuck with agricultural techniques that had been used for generations. Changing farming practices was incredibly risky when your family's survival depended on successful harvests. Experimenting with unknown crops could mean starvation if the experiments failed. But Jean-Baptiste becomes convinced that his dream is showing him a solution to the soil sickness that's devastating his region. He starts researching these wild legumes, asking traveling merchants and monks if they've seen similar plants used for agriculture in other regions. What he discovers is fascinating. Some monasteries in southern France have been experimenting with growing legumes as animal feed, and they've noticed that fields where legumes are grown seem to produce better grain crops in subsequent years. Armed with this information, Jean-Baptiste makes a decision that his neighbors think is either inspired or completely insane. He's going to redesign his entire farming operation based on his dream vision, implementing a 3-field rotation system using wild legumes that he'll domesticate specifically for agricultural use. The practical challenges are enormous. Jean-Baptiste has to convince his feudal lord Sire Guillaume de Montclair to allow him to change his land use patterns. Medieval serfs couldn't just decide to farm differently. Their agricultural practices were strictly regulated by their lords, who collected taxes and rents based on expected crop yields from traditional farming methods. When Jean-Baptiste explains his plan to Sire Guillaume, the lord's initial reaction is skeptical bordering on hostile. You want to waste 1/3 of your productive land growing weeds and another third growing nothing at all? How exactly do you expect to pay your taxes and feed your family? Guillaume asks, probably thinking that his serf has suffered some kind of mental breakdown from the stress of declining harvests. But Jean-Baptiste is remarkably persuasive. He explains that his dream showed him a way to restore the soil's fertility, that the system will eventually produce higher yields than current methods, and that other regions are already experimenting with similar techniques. More importantly, he offers to take personal responsibility for any tax shortfalls during the experimental years, essentially betting his family's future on the accuracy of his prophetic agricultural dream. Sire Guillaume, desperate for solutions to the regional agricultural crisis and impressed by Jean-Baptiste's conviction, agrees to a 3-year trial period. If the experiment fails, Jean-Baptiste will be required to return to traditional farming methods and make up any lost tax revenue through additional labor service. So Jean-Baptiste begins implementing his dream-inspired agricultural revolution. He divides his 20 acres into 3 sections and begins the complex process of domesticating wild legumes for agricultural use. This involves collecting seeds from wild plants, selecting for desirable traits like larger pods and easier harvesting, and gradually developing cultivation techniques for plants that have never been grown as crops. The first year is challenging and nerve-wracking. Jean-Baptiste plants grain in one section using traditional methods, experimental legumes in another section using techniques he's developing through trial and error, and leaves the third section completely fallow, something that seems like an enormous waste of productive land to his neighbors. His fellow farmers think he's lost his mind. Medieval communities were deeply conservative about agricultural practices because failed experiments meant starvation. Neighbors who are struggling with their own declining yields watch Jean-Baptiste waste 1/3 of his land, growing strange plants and another third growing nothing at all, while they're desperately trying to squeeze every possible grain of wheat from their exhausted soil. But as the growing season progresses, something remarkable begins to happen. The wild legumes that Jean-Baptiste is domesticating not only grow successfully, they seem to thrive in soil that's too exhausted to support good grain crops. Even more interesting, the legumes seem to improve the soil where they're growing. The earth becomes darker, richer, and more fertile looking than it's been in years. When harvest time arrives, Jean-Baptiste's results are mixed but promising. His grain yields from the traditional section are about the same as his neighbor's mediocre due to soil exhaustion. But his experimental legume crop produces more food than anyone expected, and the legumes can be dried and stored as both human food and animal feed. Most importantly, the soil in both the legume section and the fallow section looks dramatically healthier than before. The second year of Jean-Baptiste's experiment is when things get really interesting. Following his dream vision, he rotates the crops. The section that grew grain now grows legumes. The section that grew legumes now lies fallow, and the fallow section now grows grain. And this is where Jean-Baptiste's dream proves to be remarkably prophetic. The grain planted in soil that had previously grown legumes produces yields that are significantly higher than anything he's achieved in recent years. Word spreads quickly through the farming community when Jean-Baptiste's grain harvest from the previously legume section is nearly double what his neighbors are achieving from their continuously cultivated fields. Other farmers start paying attention to his strange three-field rotation system, though most are still skeptical about wasting productive land on rest periods and experimental crops. By the third year of the experiment, Jean-Baptiste's system proves definitively successful. His overall food production is higher than it's been since his grandfather's time. His soil is visibly healthier and more fertile, and his three-field rotation is producing consistent, reliable yields that far exceed what his neighbors are achieving with traditional methods. But the really remarkable impact occurs during the harvest crisis of 1187, a combination of late spring frosts and summer. Drought devastates crop yields throughout the Champagne region. Farmers who had been barely surviving on declining yields from exhausted soil find themselves facing complete crop failure and potential starvation. This is the black soil death, not a plague or disease, but the agricultural collapse that results when depleted soil can no longer sustain crops during challenging weather conditions. Jean-Baptiste's three-field rotation system, however, proves remarkably resilient during the crisis. His diversified crop production means that even when grain yields are reduced by weather problems, his legume crops provide alternative food sources. More importantly, his soil restoration techniques have created fields that are better able to support plant growth even during drought conditions. While neighboring villages face serious food shortages and some families are forced to abandon their land, Jean-Baptiste's village, which has begun adopting his rotation methods, maintains adequate food supplies throughout the crisis. His dream-inspired agricultural innovation literally saves his community from famine. The success of Jean-Baptiste's system during the 1187 crisis leads to rapid adoption of three-field rotation throughout the region. Within a decade, the agricultural techniques that originated from his prophetic dream become standard practice across much of northern France. The system he developed, rotating between grain crops, legumes, and fallow periods, becomes the foundation for medieval European agriculture for the next several centuries. From a modern scientific perspective, Jean-Baptiste's dream-inspired innovation was based on sound agricultural principles that wouldn't be formally understood until much later. The legumes he domesticated were nitrogen-fixing plants that naturally restore soil fertility by converting atmospheric nitrogen into forms that other plants can use. The fallow periods allowed soil to recover from the depleting effects of continuous grain cultivation. The three-field rotation created a sustainable agricultural system that could maintain productivity over long periods without external inputs. What makes Jean-Baptiste's story particularly remarkable is how his dream provided him with a complete agricultural system rather than just a single technique. The three-field rotation, the use of nitrogen-fixing legumes, the importance of true fallow periods, these weren't random innovations, but components of an integrated approach to sustainable agriculture that modern science recognizes as remarkably sophisticated. The long-term impact of Jean-Baptiste's dream extends far beyond his individual village. The three-field system that originated from his prophetic vision became one of the fundamental agricultural innovations of medieval Europe, supporting population growth and economic development that shaped the course of European civilization. Agricultural historians consider the transition from two-field to three-field rotation one of the most important developments in pre-modern European farming. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Jean-Baptiste's story is how it demonstrates the potential for dreams to provide solutions to complex practical problems. His sleeping mind somehow synthesized observations about soil health, plant behavior, and agricultural systems into a comprehensive farming strategy that his conscious mind couldn't have developed through logical analysis alone. Sometimes the most revolutionary agricultural innovations come from the most unexpected sources, like the dreams of a medieval peasant farmer who trusted his sleeping visions more than centuries of conventional wisdom, and whose faith in impossible agricultural techniques saved his community from famine and changed the course of European farming forever. Now, let me tell you about Jean-Baptiste de Montclair, a French peasant farmer who had a dream so specific and so practical that it accidentally invented crop rotation techniques that wouldn't be formally understood by agricultural science for another 600 years. And when I say this dream saved his village from what they called the black soil death, I'm talking about an agricultural disaster that could have wiped out an entire community during one of the most challenging periods in medieval European farming. This is 1184, in the countryside outside what's now the city of Reims, during the height of the medieval warm period. Now, you might think a warm period would be good for agriculture, and initially it was, but by the late 12th century, the extended warmth had created some unexpected problems. Soils were becoming depleted from continuous cultivation without proper rest periods, and what medieval farmers called soil sickness was spreading across northern France like a slow-moving plague. Jean-Baptiste wasn't anybody special in the grand scheme of medieval French society. He was a villein, basically a serf who was tied to the land but had slightly more rights than a complete slave. He farmed about 20 acres of what had once been fertile land in the Champagne region, growing the standard medieval crops, wheat, barley, and whatever vegetables his family needed to survive the harsh northern European winters. But Jean-Baptiste had a problem that was becoming increasingly common throughout the region. His soil was dying. After generations of his family farming the same fields in the same way, planting the same crops in the same rotation patterns that had worked for centuries, the land was simply giving up. His wheat yields had been declining for 5 consecutive years. His barley was stunted and prone to disease. Even his vegetable garden was producing sad, undersized crops that barely sustained his family through the winter months. The local priest, Father Aldrich, had been preaching that the soil sickness was God's punishment for the sins of the community. Other farmers were convinced that evil spirits had cursed their land. Some believed that the extended warm weather had somehow poisoned the earth itself. But Jean-Baptiste had a more practical suspicion. He thought the problem was that they were asking too much from the soil without giving it anything back. Medieval French agriculture at this time was based on a two-field system. Half the land would be planted with crops while the other half lay fallow. But even this fallow land wasn't really resting. It was often used for grazing livestock or growing a different type of crop. There was no understanding of soil nutrients, nitrogen fixation, or the complex chemical processes that keep agricultural land productive over long periods. Then, in the late autumn of 1184, Jean-Baptiste starts having this recurring dream that's unlike anything he's ever experienced. In his dream, he's walking through his fields. But instead of the usual crops, he sees plants he's never grown before, strange legumes with pods that seem to glow with an inner light. In the dream, these mysterious plants are somehow feeding the soil, making it richer and darker with each passing season. But the dream gets more specific and more practical. Jean-Baptiste sees himself dividing his land into 3 sections instead of 2, and he sees a detailed planting schedule that rotates different types of crops through each section in a precise pattern. In the first year, one section grows grain, another grows the mysterious glowing legumes, and the third lies completely fallow, not grazed, not planted, just resting. In the second year of his dream cycle, everything shifts. The section that grew grain now grows the legumes. The section that grew legumes now lies fallow, and the fallow section now grows grain. In the third year, the pattern shifts again. Jean-Baptiste sees this rotation continuing year after year, and somehow he knows, with that weird certainty you sometimes have in dreams, that this system will restore his land's fertility and save his family from starvation. When Jean-Baptiste wakes up from this dream, he's completely obsessed with the details. The glowing legumes from his vision look like nothing he's ever seen, but they remind him of wild plants he's noticed growing along the edges of his fields, plants that most farmers consider useless weeds. These wild legumes have small white flowers and develop pods filled with tiny seeds that nobody bothers to harvest. Now, any rational medieval farmer would have dismissed this dream as fantasy and stuck with agricultural techniques that had been used for generations. Changing farming practices was incredibly risky when your family's survival depended on successful harvests. Experimenting with unknown crops could mean starvation if the experiments failed. But Jean-Baptiste becomes convinced that his dream is showing him a solution to the soil sickness that's devastating his region. He starts researching these wild legumes, asking traveling merchants and monks if they've seen similar plants used for agriculture in other regions. What he discovers is fascinating. Some monasteries in southern France have been experimenting with growing legumes as animal feed, and they've noticed that fields where legumes are grown seem to produce better grain crops in subsequent years. Armed with this information, Jean-Baptiste makes a decision that his neighbors think is either inspired or completely insane. He's going to redesign his entire farming operation based on his dream vision, implementing a 3-field rotation system using wild legumes that he'll domesticate specifically for agricultural use. The practical challenges are enormous. Jean-Baptiste has to convince his feudal lord Sire Guillaume de Montclair to allow him to change his land use patterns. Medieval serfs couldn't just decide to farm differently. Their agricultural practices were strictly regulated by their lords, who collected taxes and rents based on expected crop yields from traditional farming methods. When Jean-Baptiste explains his plan to Sire Guillaume, the lord's initial reaction is skeptical bordering on hostile. You want to waste 1/3 of your productive land growing weeds and another third growing nothing at all? How exactly do you expect to pay your taxes and feed your family? Guillaume asks, probably thinking that his serf has suffered some kind of mental breakdown from the stress of declining harvests. But Jean-Baptiste is remarkably persuasive. He explains that his dream showed him a way to restore the soil's fertility, that the system will eventually produce higher yields than current methods, and that other regions are already experimenting with similar techniques. More importantly, he offers to take personal responsibility for any tax shortfalls during the experimental years, essentially betting his family's future on the accuracy of his prophetic agricultural dream. Sire Guillaume, desperate for solutions to the regional agricultural crisis and impressed by Jean-Baptiste's conviction, agrees to a 3-year trial period. If the experiment fails, Jean-Baptiste will be required to return to traditional farming methods and make up any lost tax revenue through additional labor service. So Jean-Baptiste begins implementing his dream-inspired agricultural revolution. He divides his 20 acres into 3 sections and begins the complex process of domesticating wild legumes for agricultural use. This involves collecting seeds from wild plants, selecting for desirable traits like larger pods and easier harvesting, and gradually developing cultivation techniques for plants that have never been grown as crops. The first year is challenging and nerve-wracking. Jean-Baptiste plants grain in one section using traditional methods, experimental legumes in another section using techniques he's developing through trial and error, and leaves the third section completely fallow, something that seems like an enormous waste of productive land to his neighbors. His fellow farmers think he's lost his mind. Medieval communities were deeply conservative about agricultural practices because failed experiments meant starvation. Neighbors who are struggling with their own declining yields watch Jean-Baptiste waste 1/3 of his land, growing strange plants and another third growing nothing at all, while they're desperately trying to squeeze every possible grain of wheat from their exhausted soil. But as the growing season progresses, something remarkable begins to happen. The wild legumes that Jean-Baptiste is domesticating not only grow successfully, they seem to thrive in soil that's too exhausted to support good grain crops. Even more interesting, the legumes seem to improve the soil where they're growing. The earth becomes darker, richer, and more fertile looking than it's been in years. When harvest time arrives, Jean-Baptiste's results are mixed but promising. His grain yields from the traditional section are about the same as his neighbors, mediocre due to soil exhaustion. But his experimental legume crop produces more food than anyone expected. and the legumes can be dried and stored as both human food and animal feed. Most importantly, the soil in both the legume section and the fallow section looks dramatically healthier than before. The second year of Jean-Baptiste's experiment is when things get really interesting. Following his dream vision, he rotates the crops. The section that grew grain now grows legumes. The section that grew legumes now lies fallow, and the fallow section now grows grain. And this is where Jean-Baptiste's dream proves to be remarkably prophetic. The grain planted in soil that had previously grown legumes produces yields that are significantly higher than anything he's achieved in recent years. Word spreads quickly through the farming community when Jean-Baptiste's grain harvest from the previously legume section is nearly double what his neighbors are achieving from their continuously cultivated fields. Other farmers start paying attention to his strange three-field rotation system, though most are still skeptical about wasting productive land on rest periods and experimental crops. By the third year of the experiment, Jean-Baptiste's system proves definitively successful. His overall food production is higher than it's been since his grandfather's time. His soil is visibly healthier and more fertile, and his three-field rotation is producing consistent, reliable yields that far exceed what his neighbors are achieving with traditional methods. But the really remarkable impact occurs during the harvest crisis of 1187, a combination of late spring frosts and summer. Drought devastates crop yields throughout the Champagne region. Farmers who have been barely surviving on declining yields from exhausted soil find themselves facing complete crop failure and potential starvation. This is the black soil death, not a plague or disease, but the agricultural collapse that results when depleted soil can no longer sustain crops during challenging weather conditions. Jean-Baptiste's three-field rotation system, however, proves remarkably resilient during the crisis. His diversified crop production means that even when grain yields are reduced by weather problems, his legume crops provide alternative food sources. More importantly, his soil restoration techniques have created fields that are better able to support plant growth even during drought conditions. While neighboring villages face serious food shortages and some families are forced to abandon their land, Jean-Baptiste's village, which has begun adopting his rotation methods, maintains adequate food supplies throughout the crisis. His dream-inspired agricultural innovation literally saves his community from famine. The success of Jean-Baptiste's system during the 1187 crisis leads to rapid adoption of three-field rotation throughout the region. Within a decade, the agricultural techniques that originated from his prophetic dream become standard practice across much of northern France. The system he developed, rotating between grain crops, legumes, and fallow periods, becomes the foundation for medieval European agriculture for the next several centuries. From a modern scientific perspective, Jean-Baptiste's dream-inspired innovation was based on sound agricultural principles that wouldn't be formally understood until much later. The legumes he domesticated were nitrogen-fixing plants that naturally restore soil fertility by converting atmospheric nitrogen into forms that other plants can use. The fallow periods allowed soil to recover from the depleting effects of continuous grain cultivation. The three-field rotation created a sustainable agricultural system that could maintain productivity over long periods without external inputs. What makes Jean-Baptiste's story particularly remarkable is how his dream provided him with a complete agricultural system rather than just a single technique. The three-field rotation, the use of nitrogen-fixing legumes, the importance of true fallow periods, these weren't random innovations, but components of an integrated approach to sustainable agriculture that modern science recognizes as remarkably sophisticated. Sometimes the most revolutionary agricultural innovations come from the most unexpected sources, like the dreams of a medieval peasant farmer who trusted his sleeping visions more than centuries of conventional wisdom, and whose faith in impossible agricultural techniques saved his community from famine and changed the course of European farming forever. Let me tell you about Tlaquelo, an Aztec agricultural priest who had a dream that literally saved the capital city of Tenochtitlan from starvation. Though you've probably never heard his name in any history book, because European chroniclers were generally more interested in documenting conquest than acknowledging indigenous agricultural genius. This is around 1450, and Tenochtitlan, the massive city built on a lake in the middle of what's now Mexico City, is facing a serious problem that would be familiar to any modern urban planner dealing with rapid population growth. The city has become so successful, so attractive to people throughout the Aztec Empire, that it's literally outgrowing its ability to feed itself. Tenochtitlan at this point is one of the largest cities in the world, with a population that most historians estimate between 200,000 and 300,000 people. To put that in perspective, London in 1450 had maybe 50,000 residents, and Paris was probably around 100,000. We're talking about a metropolis that rivals anything in contemporary Europe or Asia, built on an artificial island in the middle of a lake using engineering techniques that wouldn't be matched by European cities for centuries. But here's the thing about building a massive city on a lake. You can't exactly expand your agricultural land by clearing more forests or draining more swamps. The Aztecs had already developed chinampas, those floating gardens that were basically ancient agricultural genius, creating fertile farmland by building up soil on woven mats that floated on the lake's surface. But even with chinampas, even with tribute grain flowing in from conquered territories throughout the empire, Tenochtitlan was approaching the limits of its food supply capacity. Tlaxcala isn't a political leader or a military commander. He's what we'd now call an agricultural scientist, responsible for coordinating food production for the religious complexes that formed the heart of Aztec urban life. Temples required enormous quantities of food, not just for feeding priests and religious workers, but for the elaborate ceremonial feasts that were central to Aztec religious and political culture. But Tlaxcala starts having these absolutely extraordinary dreams about corn, and not normal corn like the varieties the Aztecs had been cultivating for centuries. In his visions, he sees corn plants growing directly out of lake water, their roots forming these intricate underwater networks that somehow purify the water while producing massive yields of grain. In his dreams, these aquatic corn plants have completely different characteristics from land-based corn. Their roots extend deep into the lake bottom, creating complex filtration systems that actually improve water quality. Their stalks are taller and more robust than normal corn, designed to withstand the wave action and water level fluctuations of lake environments. Most importantly, their yields per plant are dramatically higher than anything achievable with traditional corn cultivation. But the dream gets even more specific. Tlaxcala sees detailed visions of how these water corn plants should be cultivated, not in soil-based chinampas, but in specially designed underwater root systems that allow the plants to grow directly from the lake bottom while keeping their grain heads above water level. He dreams about specific planting techniques, spacing requirements, and harvesting methods that are completely different from anything in existing Aztec agricultural practice. Most agricultural priests would have filed this under interesting but impossible, and focused on more practical approaches to urban food security. But Tlaxcala becomes obsessed with the idea of corn that can grow in brackish lake water. He starts experimenting with different corn varieties, gradually acclimating them to higher salt concentrations and deeper water conditions. The experimentation process takes years of careful work. Tlaxcala has to develop entirely new cultivation techniques, creating underwater growing systems that can support corn plants, while protecting them from lake currents and water level changes. He has to breed corn varieties that can tolerate the mineral content of lake water, which is significantly different from the soil chemistry that traditional corn requires. His breakthrough comes when he realizes that certain traditional corn varieties, ones that had been grown in marsh environments before the development of Chinampa agriculture, actually do have some tolerance for water-based cultivation. By carefully selecting seeds from plants that survive experimental water-growing conditions, and by gradually increasing water salinity over multiple growing seasons, Tlaxcala eventually develops corn that can actually thrive in lake water. But the really remarkable part is what happens when these aquatic corn plants are grown on a large scale. Tlaxcala discovers that underwater corn cultivation doesn't just produce food, it actually improves the lake's ecosystem. The corn roots filter pollutants from the water, the plants provide habitat for fish and waterfowl, and the overall biodiversity of the lake increases dramatically. When Tlaxcala's aquatic corn gardens are fully established, Tenochtitlan becomes the first major city in human history to achieve complete food self-sufficiency through water-based agriculture. The city can literally grow all its own food on the lake it's built on, using techniques that actually improve the environmental quality of the urban waterways. The agricultural surplus generated by aquatic corn cultivation allows Tenochtitlan to support an even larger population while reducing its dependence on tribute grain from conquered territories. This political independence strengthens the Aztec Empire's stability and reduces the administrative burden of managing food transportation from distant agricultural regions. When Spanish conquistadors arrive decades later, they're stunned to find a city of unprecedented size that grows all its own food using agricultural techniques they've never seen before. Hernan Cortes' letters to the Spanish crown describe Tenochtitlan's aquatic agriculture with amazement, noting that the city's food production systems are more sophisticated than anything in contemporary Europe. Tlaxcala's dream-inspired innovation becomes part of what made Tenochtitlan one of the most remarkable urban achievements in human history. A massive, environmentally sustainable city that maintained food security through agricultural techniques that were centuries ahead of their time. Here's one that sounds like a medieval thriller novel, except it's completely real and involves enough international intrigue to make a modern spy novelist jealous. In 11th century Constantinople, a wheat merchant named Georgios Paleologus had a prophetic dream about a coming grain shortage, and his response to that dream accidentally created the Byzantine Empire's first strategic grain reserve while saving the capital from what could have been a catastrophic famine. Georgios wasn't a farmer, he was a businessman who made his living buying and selling grain throughout the eastern Mediterranean, which in the 11th century was like being a combination commodity trader, international diplomat, and maritime adventurer. Constantinople at this time was still the largest city in Europe, with maybe 400,000 residents who needed to eat every day, regardless of whether crops were successful in distant provinces. The grain trade in medieval Constantinople was incredibly complex and risky. Merchants like Georgios had to navigate not just market fluctuations and seasonal variations, but also political instability, piracy, weather disasters, and the constant possibility that your trading partners might be invaded, conquered, or simply decide to stop selling grain to Byzantine merchants for political reasons. In 1064, Georgios starts having recurring dreams that are keeping him awake at night and making his wife seriously concerned about his mental health. In these dreams, he's walking through the great granaries of Constantinople, massive stone warehouses, where the city's grain supplies were stored and they're completely empty. Not just low on grain, but actually empty with nothing but dust and rats. But the dreams get more specific and more disturbing. Georgios sees the city's harbors filled with ships, but instead of arriving with cargo holds full of wheat and barley, they're arriving empty. He dreams about Egyptian grain merchants apologizing that they have no surplus to sell, about Sicilian wheat traders explaining that their harvests have failed, about Black Sea suppliers reporting that political conflicts have disrupted their ability to export grain. Most grain merchants would have dismissed these dreams as anxiety-induced nightmares brought on by the stress of managing a high-risk international business. The grain trade was always unpredictable, and experienced merchants learned to cope with uncertainty rather than obsessing over worst-case scenarios. But Georgios becomes convinced that his dreams are showing him a genuine future crisis. He starts researching grain production conditions throughout the Mediterranean, sending messages to trading contacts in Egypt, Sicily, southern Italy, and the Black Sea region. He's asking detailed questions about harvest expectations, weather conditions, political stability, and any factors that might affect grain exports to Constantinople. What Georgios discovers through his research is genuinely alarming. Multiple regions are reporting below-average harvests due to unusual weather patterns. Political conflicts are disrupting trade routes in several key grain-producing areas. Egyptian suppliers are dealing with internal political instability that might affect their ability to maintain grain exports. Several important grain-producing regions are experiencing problems. That could significantly reduce their surplus available for export. Instead of just adjusting his own trading strategies to account for potential grain shortages, Georgios makes a decision that's either brilliant business planning or complete financial suicide. He starts buying and storing massive quantities of grain from every available source, purchasing far more than he could possibly sell through normal trading operations. Georgios isn't just buying grain, he's hoarding it on a scale that would make modern commodity speculators nervous. He purchases every spare granary in Constantinople and fills them with wheat from Egypt, barley from Sicily, rice from distant Black Sea trading partners, and any other grain he can acquire through his international trading network. His fellow merchants think he's either gone completely insane or is attempting to create an artificial grain shortage to manipulate prices. Deliberately stockpiling grain to drive up prices during shortages was considered both unethical and economically dangerous, because it could destabilize food security for entire cities. But then, in the winter of 1065, Georgios' dreams prove remarkably prophetic. A combination of harvest failures, political instability, and severe Mediterranean storms creates exactly the kind of comprehensive grain shortage that he had envisioned. Egyptian harvests are significantly below normal due to unusual Nile flooding patterns. Sicilian grain production is disrupted by Norman military campaigns. Black Sea grain exports are interrupted by conflicts between the Byzantine Empire and various northern tribal groups. While Constantinople faces the possibility of severe food shortages, Georgios has enough stored grain to supply the entire city for months. His warehouses contain the only significant grain reserves available in the eastern Mediterranean, making him temporarily one of the most powerful men in the Byzantine Empire. But instead of exploiting his monopoly position to maximize profits during the crisis, Georgios does something that surprises everyone, including probably himself. He sells his stored grain at pre-crisis prices, essentially providing food security for Constantinople while making almost no profit from his massive investment in grain stockpiling. Georgios' decision to prioritize city food security over personal profit during the crisis establishes him as one of the most respected merchants in Constantinople. His actions also inspire other grain traders to begin maintaining strategic reserves, accidentally creating the Byzantine Empire's first systematic approach to famine prevention through private commodity stockpiling. The long-term impact extends beyond just improved food security for Constantinople. Georgios' success demonstrates that strategic grain reserves can be maintained through private merchant networks rather than just government stockpiling programs. This model influences Byzantine trade policy for decades, encouraging the development of merchant-based food security systems throughout the empire. From an economic perspective, Georgios' dream-inspired grain hoarding represents one of the earliest examples of successful commodity futures planning based on long-term market analysis rather than short-term price speculation. This story comes from the Haudenosaunee Iroquois oral tradition, and it's about a dream that created one of the most sophisticated agricultural systems in pre-Columbian North America, the Three Sisters companion planting method. And when I say sophisticated, I mean this dream-inspired technique is so scientifically perfect that modern agricultural researchers are still amazed by how elegantly it solves multiple farming problems simultaneously. According to the tradition, a woman named Sky Woman had a dream in which three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, appeared to her as human figures. Now, this isn't just some vague symbolic vision about agricultural abundance. In her dream, these three sisters had very specific personalities and very specific instructions about how they needed to live together to reach their full potential. The corn sister, tall and strong, explained that she would provide support for her younger sister, the bean. But she warned Sky Woman that she needed to be planted first, given time to establish herself and grow tall enough to be truly helpful. The corn sister was proud, maybe a little vain about her height, but also genuinely protective of her siblings. The bean sister was the giver of the family. In Sky Woman's dream, she explained that while her corn sister provided physical support, she would provide spiritual nourishment, pulling nutrients from the very air and sharing them with her companions through her roots. But she was also a bit clingy, warning that she needed to wind around her corn sister to feel secure, and that she couldn't thrive if planted alone. The squash sister was the protector, spreading her broad leaves along the ground to create a living blanket that would keep the soil moist and prevent weeds from invading their shared space. She was practical, perhaps a bit bossy, insisting that she needed plenty of room to spread out, but promising that her work would benefit everyone. But here's where Sky Woman's dream gets really specific, because the three sisters didn't just explain their individual roles, they gave her detailed agricultural instructions. Plant the corn first in small hills, they said. Wait 2 or 3 weeks for the corn to establish, then plant the beans around the same hills. The squash should be planted between the corn hills, with enough space for her vines to spread without overwhelming her sisters. Most indigenous communities had sophisticated agricultural knowledge, but Sky Woman's dream provided something extra, a complete agricultural system that addressed soil fertility, pest control, water conservation, and space optimization all at once. And the really remarkable thing is that this dream-inspired technique is actually perfect from a scientific standpoint. The corn provides a natural trellis for the beans, eliminating the need for artificial support structures. The beans are legumes, which means they have rhizobia bacteria on their roots that can pull nitrogen from the air and convert it into forms that other plants can use, essentially creating natural fertilizer for the corn and squash. The squash leaves create natural mulch that retains moisture, suppresses weeds, and helps regulate soil temperature. But the nutritional aspect is equally brilliant. Corn provides carbohydrates, beans provide protein and amino acids that corn lacks, and squash provides vitamins and minerals that neither corn nor beans offer in significant quantities. Together, these three crops create a nutritionally complete diet that could sustain entire communities. Sky Woman's dream didn't just create an agricultural technique. It created a food security system that allowed Native American communities to achieve sustainable, high-yield agriculture that supported complex civilizations across North America for centuries before European contact. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Three Sisters system was adopted throughout North America by 1070 AD, spreading from Mesoamerica northward over many generations. Indigenous farmers saved the best seeds each year, creating varieties that were perfectly adapted to local environmental conditions. When European colonists first observed Native American agriculture, they initially dismissed the Three Sisters gardens as haphazard because the mixed plantings looked chaotic compared to European single-crop fields. But it didn't take long for the colonists to realize that these indigenous techniques produced higher yields with less labor than European farming methods. The really extraordinary thing about Sky Woman's dream is how it created not just agricultural techniques, but cultural practices that sustain the system across generations. The Haudenosaunee considered the Three Sisters to be divine gifts, and their cultivation was surrounded by ceremonies, stories, and social customs that ensured the knowledge would be preserved and transmitted. Women were responsible for Three Sisters cultivation, which elevated their social status within Haudenosaunee society. The agricultural work was done communally, with groups of related women working together for planting, weeding, and harvesting. This social organization meant that agricultural knowledge was shared and reinforced throughout the community. The Three Sisters also became central to Haudenosaunee spiritual practices. There were specific ceremonies for planting, for the first shoots appearing, for the green corn harvest. The agricultural cycle was integrated into the religious and cultural calendar in ways that made farming not just an economic activity, but a spiritual practice that connected communities to the natural world. Modern agricultural scientists studying the Three Sisters system consistently conclude that it represents one of the most sophisticated examples of sustainable polyculture ever developed. The technique maximizes land use efficiency, minimizes external inputs, improves soil health over time, and provides natural pest and disease resistance. What makes Sky Woman's dream even more remarkable is that recent research suggests Three Sisters, agriculture actually improves biodiversity and environmental health. The mixed plantings provide habitat for beneficial insects. The root systems of different plants create more complex soil ecosystems, and the overall system is more resilient to environmental stresses than monoculture farming. From a modern food security perspective, the Three Sisters system offers solutions to many contemporary agricultural challenges. It's water efficient, it doesn't require synthetic fertilizers, it builds soil health rather than depleting it, and it produces nutritionally complete food using techniques that can be adapted to different climates and soil conditions. Sometimes the most revolutionary agricultural innovations come from dreams that understand something fundamental about how natural systems work, even when those dreams create techniques so advanced that it takes modern science centuries to fully appreciate their genius. In 1315, during what historians call the Great Famine of Europe, an English Benedictine monk named Brother Thomas had a dream that led to the development of winter-hardy barley that helped England survive the worst agricultural crisis of the medieval period. And when I say worst agricultural crisis, I mean people were literally eating tree bark and boiling leather shoes for dinner, which gives you some idea of just how desperate things had gotten. Brother Thomas was responsible for managing his monastery's fields during a time when summers were unusually cold and wet climate conditions that were devastating grain crops across northern Europe. This wasn't your typical bad harvest year where you tighten your belt and hope for better weather next season. This was a sustained agricultural catastrophe that lasted from 1315 to 1317, killing an estimated 10 to 25% of the population in many cities and towns. The Great Famine started in the spring of 1315, when unusually heavy rain began falling across much of Europe and just kept falling. Throughout the spring and summer, it continued to rain while temperatures remained unnaturally cool. Under these conditions, grain couldn't ripen properly, leading to widespread crop failures. The soil became so waterlogged from constant precipitation that farmers couldn't even plow their fields for the next planting season. Brother Thomas's monastery, like all monastic communities, was essentially a self-sufficient agricultural operation that happened to include a lot of praying. The monks had to grow their own grain, preserve their own food, and manage their own agricultural planning without any external support systems. If Brother Thomas failed at harvest planning, 43 monks would literally starve to death before spring arrived. But Brother Thomas starts having these incredibly detailed dreams about barley plants that somehow survived being buried under snow for months, emerging in spring stronger and more robust than when they'd been planted. In his dream, he sees barley varieties that not only tolerate harsh winter conditions but actually benefit from extended cold exposure, developing more resilient root systems and producing higher yields than spring-planted grain. Most monks would have filed this under interesting religious vision and focused on more practical approaches to surviving the famine. Medieval monasteries were familiar with symbolic dreams and mystical experiences, and Brother Thomas could easily have interpreted his barley dreams as some kind of spiritual metaphor about enduring hardship through faith. But Brother Thomas has a practical streak that won't let him dismiss these dreams. The agricultural techniques he's seeing are so specific, so technically detailed, that they feel more like instruction manuals than symbolic visions. He starts experimenting with planting barley in late fall rather than spring, something that goes against all established agricultural practice in medieval England. The conventional wisdom was that fall-planted grain would be killed by winter frosts, and that spring planting allowed crops to establish strong root systems before summer heat while maximizing the growing season before autumn frosts returned. Everything Brother Thomas knew about barley cultivation suggested that his dream guidance was not just impractical, but potentially catastrophic. Following his dream vision, Brother Thomas begins experimenting with winter barley cultivation on small test plots. He plants barley seeds in October and November, allowing them to establish minimal root systems before winter weather sets in. Then he essentially abandons them to whatever harsh conditions the English winter can provide, which in 1315 to 1316 means prolonged periods of freezing temperatures, heavy snow cover, and soil conditions that would normally kill most agricultural crops. But when spring arrives, Brother Thomas discovers that his experimental winter barley not only survived the brutal winter conditions, it actually produced higher yields than spring-planted grain. The winter barley was able to take advantage of early spring growing conditions before the return of the cold, wet weather that was devastating other crops. The extended cold exposure had somehow strengthened the plant's resistance to the climatic conditions that were destroying traditional agriculture throughout England. Brother Thomas's winter barley technique spread throughout monastic communities with remarkable speed. When you're dealing with widespread famine and traditional agricultural methods are failing catastrophically, any innovation that produces successful harvests gets immediate attention from desperate agricultural communities. Other monasteries begin adopting Brother Thomas's fall planting techniques, and the innovation quickly spreads to secular farmers who are watching their neighbors' experimental crops succeed while their own traditional methods continue to fail. Archaeological evidence suggests that the adoption of winter barley cultivation was crucial in helping English communities survive the Great Famine, which killed estimated 10 to 15% of the population in southern England and even higher percentages in northern regions. The really remarkable thing about Brother Thomas's innovation is how it addressed the specific climatic challenges that were causing the agricultural crisis. The prolonged cold, wet conditions that were preventing spring-planted crops from ripening properly actually benefited winter barley varieties that had been selected for cold tolerance and extended growing seasons. Winter barley could establish root systems during brief warm periods in late fall, survive harsh winter conditions in a dormant state, then resume growth as soon as spring temperatures allowed, giving them a significant head start over spring-planted crops that had to establish themselves during the same cold, wet conditions that were destroying other agricultural production. From a historical perspective, Brother Thomas's dream-inspired agricultural innovation represents one of the most successful examples of medieval crisis response through technological adaptation. His winter barley techniques became standard practice throughout much of England and helped establish agricultural methods that continued to be used for centuries afterward. The long-term impact extends beyond just improved food security during the immediate famine crisis. Winter barley cultivation proved useful for expanding grain production into marginal lands and dealing with other environmental challenges that affected medieval agriculture. The techniques also influenced broader agricultural planning approaches, encouraging farmers to diversify their planting schedules and crop varieties as insurance against weather-related disasters. Sometimes the most practical solutions to impossible problems come from dreams that understand something fundamental about how natural systems adapt to extreme conditions, even when following those dreams requires abandoning everything you thought you knew about successful farming. Now, let's slow down a bit and talk about what's actually happening when farmers have these prophetic agricultural dreams. Because whether you believe in divine intervention or not, there are some fascinating psychological and cultural factors at play here that help explain why dream-inspired agricultural innovations have been so remarkably successful throughout human history. The agricultural mind and subconscious pattern recognition first. We need to understand that farming, especially in pre-industrial societies, required an almost supernatural level of environmental awareness. Successful farmers weren't just planting seeds and hoping for the best. They were constantly observing weather patterns, soil conditions, animal behavior, seasonal changes, and dozens of other environmental factors that most of us modern folks would never even notice. Think about it this way. A medieval farmer might spend 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, for decades, observing the exact same piece of land under every possible weather condition. They'd notice things like how the wind smells before certain types of storms, how specific birds behave before harsh winters, how soil texture changes with different moisture levels, how certain plants grow differently in various microclimates. All of this information gets stored in the subconscious mind, creating these incredibly detailed mental models of agricultural and environmental patterns. And here's where dreams become interesting, because during sleep, your brain processes and connects information in ways that your conscious mind might not. So when a farmer has a prophetic dream about a coming drought or flood, what might actually be happening is that their subconscious has been detecting dozens of subtle environmental indicators, changes in humidity patterns, animal migrations, plant behaviors, atmospheric pressure variations that their conscious mind hasn't fully processed yet. The dream becomes a way for all this subconscious pattern, recognition to surface in a form that feels meaningful and actionable. Ancient cultures understood this connection between dreams and environmental awareness much better than we do today. Cultural context of agricultural prophecy in most traditional agricultural societies, dreams weren't just personal experiences, they were considered important sources of community information. Agricultural communities often had designated dream interpreters, and significant dreams about farming were shared and discussed collectively. This makes perfect sense from a survival perspective. In communities where everyone's life depended on successful harvests, any potential insight into future agricultural conditions was valuable information that could mean the difference between abundance and starvation. The biblical story of Joseph, for instance, isn't unusual because someone had a prophetic dream about agriculture. It's unusual because that dream interpretation was applied on a national scale. Most agricultural societies had local versions of the same thing. Experienced farmers whose dreams were considered important guidance for planting and harvest decisions. Archaeological evidence suggests that many ancient agricultural communities kept detailed records of dreams, especially those related to farming and weather. These dream records were often consulted when making important agricultural decisions, much like we might consult weather forecasts or soil reports today. The psychology of agricultural innovation. There's also something fascinating happening psychologically when farmers follow dream guidance that leads to agricultural innovation. Because farming, especially traditional farming, is an inherently conservative profession. You stick with techniques that work because failed experiments mean starvation. But dreams provide a psychological framework that allows farmers to justify taking calculated risks. If your dream tells you to plant later or try a different crop variety or experiment with new techniques, you're not just randomly gambling with your family's survival, you're following divine or spiritual guidance. This dream-justified experimentation is actually crucial for agricultural development. Some of the most important agricultural innovations in human history came from farmers who were willing to try something completely different from established practice. And dreams provided a culturally acceptable way to justify that risk-taking. Ancient agricultural science, we also need to understand that pre-modern agricultural knowledge was far more sophisticated than most people realize. Ancient farmers didn't just throw seeds in the ground and hope for the best. They had detailed understanding of soil chemistry, plant breeding, crop rotation, companion planting, water management, and dozens of other techniques that modern science has only recently begun to fully appreciate. Many of the miraculous agricultural innovations that came from dream guidance were actually based on legitimate agricultural science that had been observed and tested over generations. The dreams provided the inspiration to apply this knowledge in new ways or under unusual circumstances. For example, the flood-resistant rice cultivation that Chen Wei-Ming developed after his dreams wasn't magic. It was based on detailed understanding of rice genetics and flood ecology that Chinese agricultural communities had been developing for centuries. The dream gave him the psychological framework to experiment with applying this knowledge in a new way. The role of weather and climate in agricultural dreams, one of the most interesting aspects of agricultural dream. Prophecy is how often these dreams accurately predict weather or climate patterns. And there's actually a scientific explanation for this that has nothing to do with supernatural intervention. Traditional farming communities were incredibly sophisticated at long-range weather prediction. They observed patterns in everything from animal migration and plant flowering cycles to atmospheric pressure changes and astronomical events. This information allowed them to make surprisingly accurate predictions about seasonal weather patterns. But this kind of complex, long-term pattern analysis isn't something your conscious mind can easily process. It requires integrating hundreds of subtle environmental observations into coherent predictions about future conditions. Dreams provide a way for the subconscious mind to present this complex analysis in a simplified, actionable form. So when a farmer dreams about a coming drought or an unusually harsh winter, they might actually be processing genuine environmental information that their conscious mind hasn't fully analyzed yet. Agricultural dreams and community survival. Finally, we need to understand that in traditional agricultural societies, individual farmer success was always connected to community survival. When one farmer discovered an improved technique or predicted a coming crisis, that information needed to spread quickly throughout the community for everyone to benefit. Dreams provided a culturally acceptable way to share potentially life-saving agricultural information. A farmer who claimed to have received divine guidance through dreams was more likely to be taken seriously than one who just said they had a hunch about trying something different. This community sharing aspect of agricultural dream prophecy was crucial for the spread of agricultural innovations. Many of the techniques we've discussed, Joseph's grain storage systems, Klekelil's saltwater corn, the Three Sisters planting method became widespread because they were initially shared as dream-inspired, divine guidance rather than individual experimental results. In the end, whether these agricultural dreams were divine prophecy or sophisticated subconscious pattern recognition doesn't really matter. What matters is that they provided a framework for innovation and risk-taking that helped agricultural communities survive and thrive in unpredictable environments. Let me share some truly bizarre agricultural dream stories that most historians have forgotten about. Stories that are so strange they almost seem fictional, but are documented in historical records that somehow survived the centuries. The Venetian spice farmer's salt dream in 1456. A Venetian merchant named Paolo Morosini had what might be the strangest agricultural dream in European history. Paolo wasn't really a farmer. He was a spice trader who had invested in some agricultural land on the Venetian mainland, mostly as a safe place to store his wealth and diversify. His business interests during the politically unstable period following the fall of Constantinople. But Paolo starts having these incredibly detailed dreams about growing spices in salt water. Not just any spices, specifically he dreams about cultivating saffron and other valuable spices, using techniques that involve deliberately flooding his fields with seawater. Now, any reasonable person would have ignored this dream because salt water kills most crops. It's basically agricultural suicide. You don't irrigate with seawater unless you want to turn fertile farmland into barren wasteland. But Paolo becomes obsessed with the idea, and he starts experimenting with controlled saltwater irrigation on small test plots. What he discovers accidentally is that certain spice plants, when grown in carefully managed saline conditions, actually produce more concentrated and flavorful compounds. The salt stress forces the plants to concentrate their essential oils and aromatic compounds as a survival mechanism. Paolo's salt-grown saffron becomes famous throughout Europe for its exceptional quality and potency. Merchants would travel from as far as England and Germany specifically to purchase his Say saffron, which commanded premium prices in markets across the Mediterranean. His techniques spread to other spice farmers along the Italian coast, and for several centuries, Venetian salt saffron was considered the gold standard of the spice trade. The really weird part? Modern agricultural science has confirmed that controlled saline stress can actually increase the concentration of certain flavor compounds in spice plants. Paolo's bizarre dream led him to discover principles of plant stress cultivation that wouldn't be formally understood by science for another 500 years. He accidentally pioneered what we now call halophyte agriculture, growing crops in saline conditions, based entirely on a dream that seemed impossible at the time. The Saharan date palm dream, this one comes from 14th century West Africa, where a Tuareg trader named Amello had a dream that revolutionized date cultivation in some of the harshest desert conditions on Earth. Amello wasn't a farmer. He was a caravan leader who traded salt and gold across the Sahara, spending months at a time crossing the most unforgiving landscape on the planet. But during a particularly difficult journey, when his caravan was lost and running out of water in the middle of the Sahara, he has this vivid dream about date palms growing in completely barren sand dunes, somehow thriving without any visible water source. In his dream, he sees that these miraculous date palms have roots that extend incredibly deep underground, tapping into water sources that are far below the surface. But more importantly, he dreams about a specific technique for planting date palm seeds that involves burying them much deeper than normal, along with a mixture of animal dung and crushed salt. In his dream, this combination somehow allows the seeds to survive in desert conditions that would normally be impossible for any plant life. When Amello finally reaches civilization, he becomes obsessed with this dream vision. He starts experimenting with date palm cultivation in desert areas that were previously considered too harsh for any agriculture. His deep planting technique, combined with the salt and dung mixture from his dream, actually works. The date palms he plants using his dream technique survive in desert conditions where no other agriculture was possible. The date palms Amello plants become the foundation for several oases that still exist today in the Central Sahara. His methods spread among Saharan communities, passed down through oral tradition for generations. There are still oases in Mali, Niger, and Algeria where date palms are cultivated using techniques that can be traced directly back to Amello's 14th century dream experiments. The Polynesian breadfruit prophecy here's a story from pre-contact Polynesia that anthropologists discovered through oral histories collected in the early 20th century. On the island of Raiatir around 1600 AD, a navigator farmer named Hero had a series of dreams about breadfruit trees that could somehow survive ocean voyages and be transplanted between islands. This might not sound that impressive until you realize that breadfruit trees are notoriously difficult to transplant, especially over long ocean distances. The trees have complex root systems, they're sensitive to salt spray, and they typically don't survive being moved from their original growing location. But in Hero's dreams, he sees specific techniques for preparing breadfruit saplings for ocean travel, involving wrapping the roots in specific types of seaweed and keeping them in specially designed containers made from coconut shells. The dream techniques were incredibly detailed. Hero saw exactly which types of seaweed to use, how to weave the root coverings, what size containers were needed, and even how to position the saplings in outrigger canoes to protect them from salt spray during long ocean crossings. Following his dream instructions, Hero develops techniques for transporting live breadfruit trees between Polynesian islands. His methods are so successful that they become standard practice throughout the Pacific, allowing Polynesian communities to establish reliable breadfruit cultivation on islands where it didn't occur naturally. Here's the really interesting historical connection. Captain Bligh's famous breadfruit expedition, the one that led to the mutiny on the Bounty, was actually trying to duplicate Polynesian breadfruit transportation techniques. The British had observed that Polynesians could successfully transport breadfruit trees across thousands of miles of ocean, but they never quite figured out the seaweed wrapping method that made the Polynesian technique so effective. Bligh's expedition failed partly because they didn't understand the indigenous cultivation methods that originated from Hero's 17th century dreams. The dream of the Mesopotamian beer farmer, this story comes from ancient Sumerian tablets dating to around 2100 BCE, making it one of the oldest recorded agricultural dreams in human history. A farmer named Kababa, who lived near the city of Ur, had recurring dreams about a grain that could grow in flooded conditions and could be used to make a drink that would bring joy to the gods and strength to mortals. The tablets describe Kababa's dreams in remarkable detail. She saw fields that were deliberately flooded, not accidentally, with grain growing in the standing water. But more importantly, she dreamed about specific fermentation techniques, allowing the wet grain to develop what we now know are yeasts and bacteria that create alcoholic fermentation. Kababa's dream-inspired techniques led to some of the earliest systematized beer production in human history. The flooded grain cultivation she developed created optimal conditions for the wild yeasts needed for fermentation, and her methods spread throughout Mesopotamia, becoming the foundation for beer production that sustained Sumerian civilization. What makes this story remarkable is that modern archaeologists have found evidence of Kababa's specific cultivation techniques at multiple Sumerian sites. The flooded grain fields she developed based on her dreams created a reliable source of fermented beverages that became central to Sumerian religious and social practices. The medieval German hop dream in 12th century Bavaria, a Benedictine nun named Sister Hildegard had dreams about adding a specific plant to beer that would preserve it longer and create better flavor. The plant she saw in her dreams, hops, wasn't traditionally used in beer production at the time. Most medieval beer was flavored with various herbs and spices, but hops were considered primarily medicinal plants. Sister Hildegard's dreams were incredibly specific about hop cultivation and beer production techniques. She saw exactly when to harvest the hops, how to dry them, and how to add them to the brewing process for optimal flavor and preservation effects. Her dream-inspired innovations revolutionized medieval beer production. Hop-flavored beer could be stored for longer periods without spoiling. It traveled better over long distances, and it had a distinctive bitter flavor that became the standard for European beer. Sister Hildegard's techniques spread throughout Germanic regions and eventually became the foundation for modern beer production worldwide. The really extraordinary part is that hops contain natural compounds that act as preservatives and antimicrobials, properties that wouldn't be scientifically understood until centuries after Sister Hildegard's dreams showed her how to use them effectively. And sometimes the most practical innovations come from the most unlikely sources, like dream visions of impossible agriculture, that turn out to be completely possible and remarkably ahead of their time. Well, if you're somehow still conscious at this point, which honestly surprises me, because I've been gradually slowing down my delivery for the past hour specifically to help you drift off. You've just experienced some of the most bizarre and fascinating agricultural stories in human history. From biblical dream interpreters who saved entire civilizations to medieval monks who dreamed about potatoes 8 centuries too early. From Highland clan chiefs who traded wool for Danish oats based on prophetic visions to Aztec priests who grew corn in salt water because their dreams told them to. These stories remind us that sometimes the most practical solutions come from the most impractical sources. Think about Joseph sitting in that Egyptian prison, probably malnourished and definitely traumatized, who somehow looked at Pharaoh's cow dreams and designed the world's first strategic food reserve system. Or Brother Coleman scribbling down detailed notes about vegetables that wouldn't exist in Europe for 800 years, accidentally developing agricultural techniques that would help Ireland survive future famines. Consider Marcus Valerius Corvus convincing 17 farming families to delay their planting based on dreams about ash falling from the sky, and then watching volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius prove his visions exactly right. Or Qin Wei Ming experimenting with floating rice while his neighbors thought he'd lost his mind, only to discover flood-resistant agriculture that saved thousands of lives. And maybe that's the real lesson here. In our modern world of scientific agriculture and data-driven farming, we might have lost something that these ancient farmers understood intuitively. That innovation often requires taking risks that seem completely irrational, and that sometimes our subconscious minds process information in ways that our logical, conscious thoughts never could. Maybe the most revolutionary ideas don't come from boardrooms or laboratories, but from that strange twilight space between waking and sleeping, where our minds are free to make connections that daylight logic would never allow. Maybe dreams aren't just random neural firing or psychological housekeeping, but something more mysterious, a way for consciousness to access patterns and possibilities that our everyday awareness simply can't perceive. And maybe that's why you're here listening to these stories in the quiet darkness, letting your mind wander through the strange landscape of historical impossibilities that somehow became practical realities. Maybe there's something about the dreaming mind that understands things the waking mind cannot, something that connects us across centuries to farmers and priests and clan chiefs who trusted their sleeping visions more than their waking fears. So before you finally drift off to sleep, assuming you haven't already, drop me a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. And hey, if you have any strange dreams tonight about impossible agriculture or prophetic farming visions, I'd love to hear about them. Who knows? Maybe your sleeping mind is processing some environmental patterns that could lead to the next great agricultural innovation. Sweet dreams, and remember, sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come to us when we're not even trying to think of them. Sometimes the best solutions are waiting for us in that mysterious realm where logic sleeps and possibility awakens. See you in your dreams.